So, Dr. Blackburn, you actually had an interesting segment in your LinkedIn Learning course, Understanding Supporting Asian Employees. A lot of it sort of talking about how the model minority myth leads into lived experiences. Could you maybe take a few minutes to explain what the model minority myth is, how it impacts the Asian individuals and communities today, and what we can do to move past this stereotype mindset?
Yes, that's a great question. First of all, this model minority myth is not the only stereotype that Asian people face, especially in Western countries, but it is a very predominant one. It can be a little tricky to talk about right now because it's almost in direct contrast with some of these other older stereotypes, things like what is often referred to as yellow peril or perpetual foreigner stereotypes, which are really quite reactivated at this current moment. A study that was published a couple weeks ago, a survey of American attitudes towards Asian Americans, found that twice as many Americans think that Asian Americans are at least partly to blame for the COVID-19 pandemic this year than last year. So that trend is kind of going in the wrong direction, and we see that in the continued uptick of racist verbal harassment, of violent attacks, often against Asian elders, that have been happening, and yet that ongoing rise in anti-Asian hate is often underreported or hard for us to kind of wrap our heads around. Sometimes I get asked, through media inquiries to comment on what's happening. And oftentimes the reporters, who are very intelligent, very educated people, frame their questioning almost as in where did this come from? We didn't see this coming. I thought the Asians were accepted. And that is because of this model minority stereotype. A model minority is a minoritized or marginalized group that is deemed to have had some sort of greater success economically, educationally than other minoritized groups. A model minority group is seen as having better assimilated to dominant cultural norms and standards, is maybe seen as more acceptable. In the United States, in Canada, in many parts of the world today, Asians, and particularly East Asians and some South Asians, are what we consider this model minority. And a lot of times people will be like, okay, what's so bad about that, right? If we've gone from sort of these explicitly racist anti-Asian stereotypes and tropes, explicitly racist anti-Asian laws that have been on the books in many of our countries in the past, what's the big deal about being seen as model citizens? And primarily, the big deal is that it acts as erasure in so many ways. It erases the real historical and present racism that exists against Asian communities. So by saying, oh, this group is perfectly accepted, I don't see them as people of color, they are almost white, it ignores the racist violence that's happening right now, the mass murders and killings of the late 19th and 20th centuries against Asian people, which are stories that many of us don't know because of this broader model minority stereotype. It erases individual difference, right? The idea all Asians are great at math, great at school, ignores the fact that there are Asian jocks. I really liked, drama club, and I skipped math class all the time in high school. Don't tell my mom. But, there are significant, I'm sure Dr. Sin will talk about this as well, there are significant documented mental health struggles for Asian people, and especially Asian young people, who don't feel like they fit into that little box of what it means to be an acceptable Asian. It erases challenges in the workplace. So that same study that I referenced earlier, the same survey I referenced earlier, found that most Americans think that Asians are fairly represented or are overrepresented in leadership and senior leadership positions in organizations and companies, when actually the reality is the opposite, where Asians are overrepresented in individual contributor roles, but are the least likely group to be promoted into senior leadership positions. Because part of the stereotype, Asians are hardworking, Asians are really diligent, great at carrying out somebody else's vision, maybe not the charismatic visionary leader themselves, but because we don't realize that there's this underrepresentation in leadership, we're often not actively creating pathways to leadership for people with these identities, because the assumption is they're doing just fine. There are many companies that don't even capture data about Asian employee retention, staffing, promotion, even when they're capturing data about other historically marginalized groups, because the assumption is that the Asians are doing fine. Or if they are capturing the data, it's like all lumped together, which gets me to another form of erasure, because after all, Asia, very large, very diverse continent. And so the successes of some groups are forming this stereotype, whereas the reality that there are plenty of Asian groups in lots of different countries who are struggling, who have refugee stories, who are low income. In the United States, 1 in 7 Asian American people in the US today is undocumented. And yet we don't talk about that much. It doesn't match our classed stereotypes of who Asian Americans are. See, in 1965, in the US at least, the laws changed. The Immigration Act of 1965 opened up immigration to far more different national and ethnic groups, and basically put preference on people with skills in things like medicine, technology, engineering, these jobs that we traditionally associate with Asianness. And those jobs, most of the time, people coming to do those jobs are coming from higher education backgrounds in their home countries. You have to be pretty well educated to be a doctor. And if you are coming from a higher education background, you tend to be coming from a higher social class background. So that means that in many ways we were like, and still are, actively almost skimming off the top, you know, the best and brightest of people in their home countries. We also know that a highly educated parent is far more likely to raise highly educated children. So this starts to perpetuate in a generational way. And then ignoring all of that, you know, policy, history, context for why there are some Asian groups that are doing well because of this like cherry picking, it's used against other minoritized groups. So I'm sure that you've heard people say something like, the Asians are doing really well, why can't XYZ group also do very well? So this model minority myth is not just harmful for Asian people, it doesn't just erase their experiences, it's used to erase the experiences of other people. You know, look, they're so hardworking, they're so diligent, they're so loyal. There is no such thing as racism because the Asians are doing great. There is no such thing as bias because the Asians are doing great. If you search Twitter right now, you will see somebody making that argument. And it's very frustrating and harmful because it ignores both the true history of Asian people, Asian immigrants, and the true histories of people from other marginalized groups who've had to deal with systems of enslavement, of redlining, of, you know, really harmful immigration practices and policies. And so all of that, you know, when people are like, oh, what's so wrong? It's a positive stereotype. Every positive stereotype holds a lot of flip side negatives for both the people who are being ascribed to that positive and to other groups as well. That was a very quick overview, David, but I hope that's helpful.
I take myself off mute. Sorry about that. Thank you so much for that. It really is enlightening, and you know how you said it sort of works against other marginalized groups, and that, you know, I think it really does help in regards to some places create division amongst the minorities, which is what we don't need. We need to sort of come together and work together.